Each year many thousands travel to Ypres or the rolling downlands around Albert, where the mighty battle of 1916 on the Somme took place. But there's much more to the Great War and the men and women who fought in it. So what can we find? What does it mean to go beyond the Somme? I've just come back from another battlefield recce, looking at the Great War battlefields from the Chemin des Dames to Reims to Verdun and the Argonne. These recces that we do as part of our work as battlefield guides are really important to kind of set the scene of the tour, to enhance the archive and paper research that we've done to make these tours possible, and bring together something that we often discuss on this podcast, bring together the elements of the landscape of the Great War so that when we visit those areas with groups, we can help them understand that landscape too and understand what it is that they're seeing on that modern landscape and how it relates to the landscape of the First World War. Because to the average visitor, a field is a field, a wood is a wood, downland looks no different than the downs of Sussex or Hampshire or Wiltshire or so many other places besides. And part of the craft, I guess, of a battlefield guide is to take that landscape as it is today and to relate it to the past in a meaningful and understandable way. And the recces are very much part of that. And when we go on these recces, it's not really to do the historical research. We find out a lot of stuff along the way that sometimes you can only do by being on the ground. And even if you've read 100 reports of the Battle of Verdun or the British on the Aisne in 1914, until you've seen the ground where their trenches were dug, where their attacks went in, perhaps it's not truly understandable until you've done that. And that's a really important part of it too. But what those recces, I think, offer us when we get out on the ground to prepare for a new tour is to have some vital thinking time, to think about the subjects that we're going to discuss and look at our own pieces of the jigsaw and see how that fits together in a meaningful way for us to relate the history of these battlefields that we're going to take groups to. And on this particular recce, I had an advantage. I've been visiting Verdun and all of these places since the 1980s, and I've been guiding groups to Verdun since the late 1990s, so for more than a quarter of a century now. But for my colleagues, this was their first time on that ground, first time joining up some of the bits. They'd been to one or two locations that we went to, but it was to kind of see how they fitted into the wider picture and the wider tour that we were doing. But it's that thinking time on these battlefields that is so important, and it gives me time to reflect on many of the things that we discuss and talk about in this podcast. And as I mentioned in a recent podcast, which was celebrating 4 years of producing The Old Front Line, doing this, talking to you pretty much every week one way or another, has helped me shape in my mind the language of landscape that has been buzzing around in my head like jumbled up jigsaw pieces for years, and hopefully making some sense of that and chiming too, I hope, with your experience of visiting this landscape and understanding this landscape. And I know from some of the emails that I've had in response to that recent episode, a lot of you have said that it's helped you shape your view of this and understand the importance of landscape in the picture and the history of the Great War. And one of those little phrases connected with this that I've thought about for a while now is this idea of beyond the Somme. I've had this conversation with quite a few people. Well, Beyond the Somme is this. Well, if you travel beyond the Somme, you'll find that. And what does that mean? And why the Somme? Well, for most English-speaking visitors who travel to the Western Front, the battlefields extend from the Flanders coast through Ypres down into northern France, across those forgotten front battlefields of 1915 down to Arras and the Hindenburg line at Cambrai, and onwards, ever onwards, to the Somme, mainly for most people in the 1916 battlefields, let alone the 1918 ones, but certainly that Somme region. And the River Somme cuts through that area of the old front line, and it kind of delineates north from south. North is really small. South, the rest of the Western Front, is still hundreds of miles where those trenches ran. And that idea of beyond the Somme is to try and discuss the idea of getting beyond those battlefields that are just linked to what is largely the British and Commonwealth story of the Great War. And there is nothing wrong with just visiting those battlefields. Many of you listening to this podcast have personal family connections, grandfathers, great uncles, and so many others who fell and fought in those battlefields, and that's what draws you back every time. And that is great. And if that's what you do for the rest of your visiting life to those battlefields, is to travel to Ypres and visit the Somme and a few other places besides, that is absolutely fine. Of course it's fine. And there's no kind of pecking order of people who visit here and there, and one is better than another. But I sense that many of you want to understand the Great War and want to get a lot more out of it than you currently do, which is why you listen to this podcast and many others besides. So for me, the idea of beyond the Somme is kind of challenging yourself to say, I've got a pretty good idea of what happened in the four battles of Ypres and in the engagements on the Somme in 1916 and the spring and the summer of 1918. And I've been to Cambrai, and I've walked around the Hindenburg line and crossed the Canal du Nord and the Ricqueval Bridge. But I don't know what really happened on that bulk of the Western Front that was occupied for most of those 4 years of the Great War by the French army. France was the major partner from the very beginning. The sheer size of the French army made that so. And to not visit their battlefields and the battlefields connected to the story of the French army and what was largely for most of the war a French war in inverted commas, not to do that is limiting, I guess, your understanding of the bigger picture of the First World War on the Western Front. And I get why people don't do it, because to visit a lot of these battlefields requires some knowledge of French, even better German, because most of the sources and even most of the guidebooks are in those languages. But you've got to remember that in the early stages, for me and many of those that at that time that I looked up to, who'd been visiting the battlefields for decades, guidebooks were pretty much non-existent. The only thing that we had was Rose Coombs, that came out in the 1970s, and there were a few earlier editions of guidebooks that gave you a few hints of places around Reims, and perhaps you could look at the English translations of the Michelin guides that mentioned Verdun and the Chemin des Dames and the Champagne, but there was nothing in any kind of depth. And what a lot of those people, those kind of wayfinders of the early years of battlefield visiting did, is to get out on the ground and find things, explore, and then try and piece those jigsaw pieces that you found as you explored those battlefronts, piece them together and make some sense of it. So even if you don't speak French and you don't speak German, there's still a lot to get from visiting those battlefields connected largely with the French and German story. And what you find along the way, of course, as well, is an interaction with the British Army's foray into some of these areas at the two ends of the war, with the British on the Marne and the Aisne in 1914, and then returning to those sectors with the battles of 1918 on the Chemin des Dames and in the Second Battle of the Marne in the summer of that year. But also, of course, the arrival of the Americans, the American Expeditionary Force, America entering the war in 1917, and the AEF taking part in the battles, key battles of the last 100 days or so of the conflict. So it's not just a French and German story. And once you add in France's colonies, its empire, it's an even wider story and a fascinating one. And I guess what I'm hoping from this podcast is that this might inspire you to take that journey yourself and go beyond the Somme, to understand that the British sacrifice in the Great War was immense, but France, a country pretty much the same size population-wise as Britain, perhaps a little bit less than Britain in 1914, by the end of that conflict, Britain, excluding the Empire, the Commonwealth, had lost over 700,000. France had lost 1.4 million, twice as many. And the effect on France, both in the immediate post-war period and a generation later, as to how France saw itself and how it saw itself in war, was everlasting, the effect of those casualties. And once you do then weave America into this story, you begin to see repercussions of not just the fighting during that period on the Western Front, but America's entry into a European theatre of operations, which then would have repercussions, again, generation later in the Second World War. And what you find as you traverse places like Verdun is those elements then crisscross, because 1 minute you're on the Voie Sacrée, that important and vital supply route that took French supplies and men into the heart, the beating heart of the Verdun battlefield. And then the next minute you're on the Voie de la Liberté, the Liberty Way, which was the route of American liberation in 1944, where, as we've said so many times on this podcast, a place where the First World War meets the Second. And for me, I think the more that I go back and I look to those early years of exploring that ground beyond the Somme, I kind of sometimes feel that that is where, to a certain degree, we find the true Western Front. Because one of the things that we go and search for when we visit those battlefields are the visible remains of it. And we can go to Vimy Ridge and we can see that pockmarked landscape, the mine craters amongst the trees, the area where the sheep graze, where there's shell crater after shell crater. And we can extrapolate that view that we see there across the entire landscape of northern France and think, that's what it once looked like. And down on the Somme, we have the trenches of the Newfoundland Park. There's a little bit of German trench position in a place called Soyecourt, south of the River Somme, and a few other places. But generally, those landscapes in France, and particularly so in Flanders, where there's been so much development in recent years, where our trenches are confined to the earliest trench museum at Sanctuary Wood, the reconstructed trenches at Zonnebeek and Bayenveld Kruenart Wood, and up on the Yser Canal at the Trenches of Death at Dixmude, concreted trenches preserved along the canal there. These are small areas of trenches, and even once we get off the beaten track, there are not that many areas of woodland where we'll find extensive trenches, and the ones that are there are largely private, and access is not easy, but there's still only a small amount of trench remains. Once you get beyond the Somme and down into some of these regions around Reims and Soissons and Verdun and beyond down towards the Vosges, you can drive through a wooded area for just an hour and past more areas of preserved trenches than on the whole of the British front in northern France and Belgium. There is so many visible remains of the First World War, from shell holes amongst the trees to clear, defined and often very deep lines of trenches and bunkers and positions, and so much more. And I guess this is kind of what I've thought we'd talk about in this podcast, really, and some of the things that I found when we were out on on this battlefield recce last week. And I think that area beyond the Somme, all of this is what makes it a precious historical resource, given the nature of what this landscape has to tell us. We're not just seeing it as some kind of frivolous artefact to amuse tour groups and delight tour groups as they see the crumbling trenches and shell holes. That sounds too much like that poem, High Wood, that there's a warning to all of those who are involved in battlefield tourism, battlefield pilgrimages, whatever we may call it. But I think if we're going to see it as a proper historical resource, it's how it unlocks our understanding of what we read in the books, to see the physical remains. Many of us are fascinated by battlefield archaeology, and here that archaeology is in great amounts within the trees and the fields and the preserved areas that we find in that ground beyond the Somme. But it's a working landscape, a modern landscape, as well as a landscape of the past, one where people live and have families, go about their lives. It can't just be an outdoor museum. If the war was fought for anything, it was fought for the freedom of ordinary people to live their lives as they wished. And we can't deny that more than a century later, just to preserve a trench or a shell hole. But there has to be a happy medium. And I guess that is the internal question, really, when we discuss the nature of that First World War landscape and the whole culture of the old front line. What does it mean? What do we want from it? What should we preserve? And what should be allowed to fade? Because not everything can be saved. And maybe that's a discussion for another day. But what do we find then beyond the Somme that makes it so different? Let me tell you about those few days I spent in just 3 parts of it last week. We began our journey northwest of Reims in the department of the Aisne and on the Chemin des Dames. The Chemin des Dames, the Ladies' Way, is a piece of high ground that runs in that area northwest, as we said, of Reims, which was vital to the dominance of that ground in the early battles. The German army advanced in the Schlieffen Plan, heading for Paris. It was pushed back from the gates of Paris to the Marne in that critical battle of September 1914 that stopped the Schlieffen Plan in its tracks and pushed the German army back over the Marne, over the River Aisne, and it pulled back to these Aisne heights, including the Chemin des Dames. The Germans dominated that ground between Soissons and Reims for much of the rest of the war, and although British troops were in front of it in that early stage, when the BEF had marched from Mons down to the Marne, new units had arrived from Saint-Nazaire and also from other ports and through the railway system to reinforce the BEF, reservists having been brought over from the depot to replace the losses at Mons or Le Cateau or during the retreat. And the BEF found itself, the British Expeditionary Force, found itself on these Aisne heights, close to what became known generally as the Chemin des Dames in some of those earliest periods of trench warfare on the Western Front. It's a fascinating area where so many strands, so many jigsaw pieces and layers of the Great War come together. And as you travel through the Aisne Valley, looking at the bridges over the canal and the river, these are bridges blown in the Great War and also blown in the Second, because this is yet another one of those places where those two great wars meet. And when you're up on the Chemin des Dames, near to the Fort Malmaison, one of the mighty forts that was up there, fought over, turned into a moonscape in 1917 during one of the latter battles on the Chemin des Dames. That is the site of a massive German Second World War cemetery with the dead, principally the dead from the Blitzkrieg of 1940. And we started our journey just off the motorway. We came down from Calais. It's a much longer distance, but you come down through northern France, you pass the back areas, you come past Arras and Cambrai, and you see the Canal du Nord and parts of the Hindenburg Line, and the cemeteries, the British cemeteries out in the fields where the Hindenburg Line battles took place in 1917-18, the 4th Australian Division Memorial. You're close to Rickervale Bridge. You can see the wind farms across the ridge near Joncourt, where Wilfred Owen was in October of 1918. There's so much history that you pass. Manchester Hill, Saint-Quentin, and then you are beyond the Somme, heading down there. And it takes a good 3 hours or so to get down to that area beyond Laon, and coming off for the signpost of the Chemin des Dames into the area near to the village of Berry-au-Bac. That's where we began, where the French tank memorial is located, because in the offensive here of April 1917, this was the first occasion in which the French army used tanks, Schneider tanks in this case. And when I first came to this memorial in the 1980s, it was a memorial listing the tank crews who had died. It was then flanked by 2 Cold War period French tanks, an AMX-13 and AMX-30. The AMX-30 is still there, but they've replaced the other tank with a model, a reconstruction, a life-size reconstruction of a Schneider tank in period camouflage. And it's very, very impressive. A superb way to see the battlefields where the first French tanks were used, and understand what those tanks look like, to look at their limitations compared to the British Mark I and the later models, and look at how the French implemented their tanks and what their purpose were. And so this is the kind of first piece of the jigsaw, a different approach to the tank design. The tracks look much more like some kind of agricultural vehicle. It's not a rhomboid shape with the tracks going round it. The sponson fires only in one direction. There are multiple machine guns, but it has quite a few design flaws. And when they were used here on the Chemin des Dames, they suffered crippling losses in that first battle, and it wasn't a particularly successful use of tanks. The French then went on to develop their tank force and bring in light tanks and assault guns. So it developed as the war went on, but it's a good starting place to begin to assemble that part of this jigsaw that we keep referring to. But in terms of why Beyond the Somme is so important, we're standing there looking at a tank memorial, but we can look to our left back towards Reims, and there just beyond the Aisne Canal is a bit of rising ground near a grain silo now, and the ground visibly rises up where the trees are, and that is a place called Cope 108, just on the other side of Berry-au-Bac. There the French and the German lines met, and the war went underground, and absolutely massive charges of explosive were blown there, forming some just incredible mine craters. And they are all still there. In the 1920s and 30s, they were tourist attractions. They were very much on that kind of battlefield route. There are lots of postcards and panoramic photographs of them, and it is a subject that I am going to discuss on this podcast in a future episode, but it's hidden away there now. It's not open to the public. Once in a while, the Aisne Tourism Board organise a little walk through that bit of the battlefield, but it's not generally open to the public. And what was once one of the most visited parts of this battlefield has been closed to ordinary visitors for quite some time. But it sat there, covered in undergrowth and essentially preserved. And what is underneath that undergrowth and on the top of that hill above that canal and the grain silo is an incredible piece of Great War history. And already, just by kind of casting our eye around us, we're beginning to see what there is in places like this. And then we travelled down into the Aisne Valley, the River Aisne, and the Aisne Canal run through here. It's a pivotal part of this area of the battlefields. The Germans pushed over that canal, defending some of the blown bridges, the BEF building bridges across the canal, cavalry patrols going forward, try and probe the enemy, and then infantry crossing on footbridges and pontoons and pushing through the little tiny villages that you come across as you drive through this valley and getting up onto the Aisne heights beyond, where they met the Germans once more and dug in. And we went through the village of Braine, which used to be one of my little bases in this area where the BEF was in 1914. Used to have a fantastic little private museum there back in the day, sadly no longer there. And that took us through the wooded valleys with tracks going off in every direction, signs to French unit memorials, French colonial artillery up there whose monument is on the hillside, little private graves and memorials to individual poilus, bonhommes who were killed in that part of the battlefields in the later battles. And that took us into the village of Soupir, which I have discussed as a podcast previously. But there we went into the churchyard, which is where we'll take our groups, and we had a wider explore of that ground, looked at the chateau grounds at Soupir. The chateau dominated this tiny little village. It was a headquarters for British troops during the fighting there in 1914. And what we've got there is a kind of insight into the very earliest military cemeteries that were made by British troops. These are not Tyne Cots, they're not Lissenherks, they're not Sayre Road cemeteries. They're communal cemeteries, men buried on already consecrated ground close to the places where they were fighting. And in Soupir churchyard, you have a sprinkling of men from different regiments, guardsmen, Connaught Rangers, Oxon Bucks Light Infantry. You have a lot of officers buried together who were killed up on the Aisne Heights above Soupir. And you have a second cemetery. Now, these were not closed and consolidated, but if you go up to just above the village, you have Soupir Communal Cemetery, which is a small collection of graves, almost all guardsmen, almost all officers, and very heavily represented by public schoolboys, in particular from Eton. And this is a cemetery with a number of burials that it has technically does not qualify for a cross of sacrifice, but yet it does have one. And I often wonder, given the kind of influential families whose sons were buried here, perhaps they pushed for a cross to be put in place. So already we've gone slightly off the beaten track. It's not really even signposted, that communal cemetery. You could miss it. It's tucked away just above at the back of the village, and there is an amazing bit of First World War history and so many stories amongst the headstones. There's just a handful of headstones that are in there. But it doesn't just end there. There is a wooded route up to where the front lines were, which I made in the early 1990s with some friends. We walked up through that ground and climbed the sheer slope at the end of it. We found dugouts that were marked on British sketch maps of 1914, and even an upside-down French 75 shell case hanging up in one of them from one of the later users of these dugouts that had been used as a gas alarm, still hanging there after all of those years. But the easier route is to go back through Soupir and drive up to the Cour de Soupir, the farm of Soupir, up on the high ground above the village, and beyond that, the vast open fields where the front lines were, close to a cavalry called La Croix-sans-Tête. And that sat in no man's land with the Germans just one side, and you can look across the flat plateau of the fields there towards the edge of the woodland, which is at the other end of the ravine that moves up from Soupir village, and that's where the front lines were. Men of the Oxon Bucks Light Infantry and the Essex Regiment and the King's Royal Rifle Corps were dug in there. And they were firing a lot of rounds, because I've walked that field a few times and found fired 303 rounds up there. The British didn't return to that area in 1918, so those bullets must have been from old contemptibles from BEF soldiers in 1914. But in those woods, amongst those trees, are the crumbling trenches that were the original trenches dug by the British Army in the first truly static part of the Great War here in September and October of 1914. This was the place where, for the British soldier, trench warfare began. And then his French brother, his poilu, his bonhomme that followed, they then took over these trenches, and this became the front line until the Chemin des Dames attacks in April of 1917, and the ground was then heavily fought over again in the battles of the last year of the war. So again, so many layers here. You can come just to visit one communal cemetery, a churchyard cemetery, and find so much more. But going back down into Soupir it's not just the British graves, it's a truly international burial site, Superior, because on top of those two small British burial grounds, there are two very large French ones, one large German one, and an Italian military cemetery. The Italian forces were fighting in this part of the Western Front in 1918, and this is one of their burial sites. We tend to think of the Italian army being obviously largely occupied in fighting the Austro-Hungarian army on the Isonzo front or up in the mountains, but Italian units fought on the Western Front as well. So this is an important kind of landmark to them, and another part of the jigsaw and another layer. And as you travel around now, a lot of the local tourism organisations have put up information panels in these places which are in multiple languages, not just French and German, but in English too. So already, even if you don't speak those languages, there is information for you to tap into, and you can find leaflets and booklets in some of the tourist offices as well. But even if none of that existed, coming to Superior and seeing those different cemeteries, how the British chose to bury and honour their dead, how France did it, how the Germans in some respects were forced to do it, and how they then chose to do it following a second Great War, in the way that cemeteries were regrouped and Kameradengrab and mass graves were placed in them, and then looking at the overtures and the remembrance of another ally that perhaps is forgotten because of the events of a Second World War. Who knew that the Italian army was fighting alongside France and Britain and America on the Western Front in that last year of the war? And walking through that simple archway of the entrance of the Italian cemetery to see some very Italian names on the crosses within is a very poignant moment, realising just how global this war is. And when we look in the French cemeteries and see the Muslims from their African empires and men from Indochina who had come to serve, again we can see just how far this war reached into countries and communities and cultures and brought them to the troglodyte world of the Western Front. And then from there we went up above those Aisne heights. We continued in the direction of the British forces in September 1914 and the French on their flanks, up onto that Chemin des Dames, that Ladies' Way, that whole ridge line of high ground. We went through Vendresse, and we saw the large British cemetery there and the smaller communal cemetery where some of the men of the BEF are buried, again in that typical kind of small burial site. But our route was to the Chemin des Dames and the great battle there in April 1917 when the French army under General Nivelle, the Nivelle Offensive, as it's often called, was launched in this area to try and push the Germans back, and resulted in tremendous losses, and eventually was part of the pathway to French army mutinies in 1917. But again, the landscape gave up so much. We could see the importance of this ridgeline, why the Germans wanted to hold on to it and why the French wanted to take it from them. And up at Cerny, on the crest of the Chemin des Dames, there is a chapel that was built in the 1950s. It was a very late memorial. There was no proper memorial to the Chemin des Dames, perhaps because of its connection to the mutinies of 1917. The chapel was built post-Second World War, and there is one of the lighthouses that was built there that were placed on several battlefields, French battlefields of the Great War, to light and mark and honour those battlefields. And there was this kind of French feeling that the light would be cast into the darkness above those sites of the woods and the fields and the crumbling trenches and the cemeteries and the monuments, and it would somehow illuminate the souls of France's heroes who died there in the great battles of the First World War. And there is a French cemetery, and alongside it a German cemetery, and already you can perhaps hear how many German cemeteries that we're coming across in this journey in just a small area. It's not like the Somme where there's only a couple that are easily discoverable without going well off the beaten track. It's not like Flanders where we kind of gravitate towards Langemarck or Menin or Vladslo. There are many, many German burial grounds here, many of which still retain some of the original headstones, for example, and that's another layer and part of the jigsaw that we find through discovering this area. And up on that chemin des dames, we find crumbling villages that were destroyed, villages détruits, disappeared villages destroyed and never properly rebuilt. And one that I went to up there in the early 90s, there were the crumbling remains of cellars and buildings, bottles dropped by former occupants many decades before. It was a really incredible kind of place to visit. And the trench lines just seem to go on and on in the woodland that's there. When you walk up some of these tracks to try and find the regimental memorials are tucked away up there, you can see amongst the trees trenches just going on and on and on and on. And we're not talking shallow depressions, we're talking very deep trenches, still in exceptionally good condition in terms of their depth and their width and their structure, even after all that time. And I think this shows us that just on one battlefield, we can immediately find so many of these layers of the French experience of the Great War in that ground beyond the Somme. And through the two bookends of the war, 1914 and 1918, how Britain's role fits in to all of that. And when we go to Soissons, under the shadow of Eric Kennington's stone British Tommies, with that kind of Art Deco style to them, as part of the Soissons Memorial that commemorates the missing of May to the summer of 1918 in this sector, we have time to consider so many of these jigsaw pieces and layers when we stand there with the modern world unfolding around us. And then from the Chemin des Dames and the Aisne, our next day took us to Verdun. Verdun, one of the great names, one of the terrifyingly great battles of the First World War, which we've discussed a few times on this podcast, and one I know we will return to many, many times to come, because in some ways it is the ultimate Great War battle, and when you visit it, perhaps one of the ultimate Great War battlefields to go and see and to connect to. The longest battle of the war, 300 days, 300 nights, the incredible number of shells that were dropped, 2.5 million shells in 9 hours in one bombardment, the casualties, over 770,000 French and German casualties there in 1916, and the shelling in some areas, 1,000 shells per square metre, turning that landscape into a moonscape, a lunar landscape of shell craters. Some of the most potent images of the wartime landscape of the Great War come from French and German sources, showing the ravines smashed to bits, to oblivion by shell fire, with matchstick trees and the shattered faces of poilus looking back at the camera, or German soldiers, depending on whose photograph it was. Verdun, in many respects, is this vast open-air museum, and the landscape here is preserved under the canopy of a national forest. A decision was made to preserve this battlefield. Churchill went to Ypres after the war and said this should be forested and preserved for all time. France, dominated by the experience of Verdun, its national press obsessed with it. Ils ne passeront pas, they shall not pass. All of that. And the generals from Nivelle to Pétain, who defended this ground against the Germans and retook much of it later in the battle, it was a national obsession. When it came to memorialising the Great War in the post-war period for France, in some respects the war began and ended with Verdun, and the decision was made to turn it into a national forest, and by doing so preserve this landscape under that canopy of trees. I remember the first time I went here in 1987, we just drove down a road from the ossuary towards Fort Douaumont, stopped, and I walked off into the forest just a short way. Shell holes everywhere, trenches just weaving off through the trees, and in those trenches and shell holes, the detritus of war, helmets, bayonets, mess tins. It was everywhere, and it seemed impossible to pick any of this stuff up. It was part of that landscape. So I left, and I looked, and I turned away. Now it's all gone. That element, that layer of the landscape is gone. So many people have picked it up. Some of it is in the museum at Fleury as part of the display there. But even in a national forest, things change. The forest is a commercial forest, and it's been replanted and trees regrown, and in doing so in some areas, whole sections of that battlefield landscape have been lost as the tree logging machines come in and chop those trees down and churn up the landscape, destroying the shell holes and the trenches and the positions and the mortar pits and everything else. That is done a little bit more sympathetically now. I noticed this time again, after being there last summer, that when the trees are removed, a lot more of the landscape is preserved, and that can only be a good thing. And our reason for being there was to bring tour groups here, so we went to see what is, for the casual visitor, some of the more important locations: the Memorial Museum at Fleury, the ruined village, destroyed, the village disparu of Fleury, where you can walk down the main street and there's a nice concrete little path you can walk down now and see the names of the baker and the shoemaker and the school and the town hall and everything else, and it's just shell holes and there's just nothing left of it. It was never rebuilt, one of these villages that was almost kind of sacrificed really on that landscape as part of this national obsession to forest it and preserve it. And we went there, we went to the ossuary, the huge memorial that dominates that Verdun battlefield, beneath which are the graves of 16,000 French soldiers from France and all over its empire, but beneath the actual physical monument are the bones of over 120,000 soldiers of all nations who fought at Verdun during the Great War, pulled in off those shattered battlefields and placed in this ossuary, this mass grave beneath the monument, which itself was really a warning. And as part of that warning, glass panels were fitted to the ossuary so you can curiously, almost barbarically, look in and see the piles of pelvises and rib cages and skulls looking back at you. It was a warning, but a warning, of course, that would eventually fail. And within decades of this memorial being built, soldiers of the Wehrmacht were standing in front of this memorial having their photograph taken like tourists having conquered France in 1940. And in having their photograph taken there, did they realise that part of the reason for their success in that campaign was the very monument they were standing in front of now? France shattered by these losses, broken by these losses, could they ever possibly fight a Verdun again? And of course we went on to the forts after that, Fort Douaumont, Fort Vaux, the ones that are easily accessible, open to the public. So much to explore both within those forts and on top of them. You can stand there on the roof of Douaumont, look off into the distance. You can't see any physical part of it, but up there, not many tens of kilometres away, is another fort, Fort de Fermont, part of the Maginot Line, and from the roof of that fort you can look back across this landscape and see the tower of the Douaumont ossuary. Those two great wars once again intertwining here on this landscape. But as we traverse the forested avenues, my mind returned to those visits made over many years since that first time I stood here at Verdun in the 1980s, and I saw so many echoes of walking this ground, exploring this ground. Here was the ruined water tower of Fort Souville. There was a casemate Pamar bunker, one of the types of bunkers built after the Battle of Verdun in this area, with machine guns and observation posts within them. They almost look like something out of science fiction when you see them, almost like a face, a mask of an alien warrior looking back at you. They're incredible pieces of military engineering tucked away in the glades around Verdun as you walk that ground. And you can peer in at Douaumont again into the moat and see where Sergeant Kuntz and his pioneers came down into the moat, and where he managed to get into the aperture of the machine gun post, if that is indeed how that episode played out, and got into the central corridor of the fort and was drawn by the noise of the 155 turret firing and took the last remaining French soldiers defending the fort prisoner, silencing not just the guns and the gunners, but silencing the fort of Douaumont itself, a fort that, to be retaken, it was once calculated may have cost the lives of 250,000 French soldiers, and the fort itself not retaken after its capture in February 1916 until October of that year by General Mangin's colonial soldiers. And what you're faced with when you explore Verdun is where to start, where to begin, where to end, where does it stop? You could be there all day and all night in many respects, because the signposts are there at every turn, promising other places written in the blood of Blue Horizon and in the blood of Field Grey. But this is only one layer, just a few pieces of that Verdun jigsaw. There's so much more to Verdun. It feels like one of those battlefields you can eternally get lost in, that even if you go there 100 times or 1,000 times, and I've lost track of how many times I've been to Verdun now, there is a continuous sense of discovery, mirroring, certainly for me, what it was like in those early years of visiting the old front line. There's always something new to find, a new avenue to walk, a clearance of trees gets you a view you didn't have before and takes you to a bunker, an entrenchment, an ouvrage, whatever it is. And I think that is certainly part of its appeal and certainly what it has to give us. And even down in the city we find much more. I noticed there's a renovation of the citadel, which is where France's Unknown Warrior was chosen just after the war and was an important part of the headquarters, the command and control of the French forces at Verdun, and a new battlefield, military history cafe, museum and shop in part of the citadel as well. A new business just opened up to accommodate the increasing number of visitors to Verdun. So the Great War is not kind of sliding off into the distance to be forgotten. It seems to be returning as a subject of interest for a wider audience. And that was good to see, both with adult visitors to the battlefields that we saw as we travelled around Verdun that day, but school groups too. At the memorial at Fleury, French and German school groups heard the context of the battle in their own language and then went out onto that battlefield to see where those two nations wrestled for supremacy and power, and where their blood was shed in such great numbers, in such great amount in 1916. And then our final day was a partial return to Verdun. We were almost back there again because we'd crossed onto the left bank, not to visit Mortholm or Cote 304, but to go to the battlefields of the Meuse-Argonne, where the American Expeditionary Force fought in those last 6 weeks of the Great War, from September through to the very last moments of the war on the 11th of November. Here was a battlefield where the pathways of 1916 crossed over with the men of that new world where America entered onto a world stage for the first time. And coming off the motorway, we drove up to the little town of Varennes. It's different terrain. At Verdun, you can't always really assess the terrain that you're moving through because of the national forest. Here in the Meuse-Argonne, the landscape hasn't really changed very much, and you have small villages and long straight roads and windy little tracks and wooded hills and clear points of observation for an enemy to defend. And on that Great War landscape, line after line after line of trench defence. So you begin to understand really what lay ahead of the American Expeditionary Force as they moved into this Meuse-Argonne offensive. It began here on the 26th of September 1918, when a 600,000 strong US First Army assaulted the German lines on a wide front. More than 2,700 guns, over 180 tanks and more than 800 aircraft participated in the assault. 0 hour, was at 5:30 in the morning that day, following a barrage, a 3-hour barrage, which cost $1 million a minute, it is said. The men at the time referred to it as the $1 million barrage. And it wasn't just shells, it was gas, and it was flame too. For America, this was its biggest offensive since the Civil War. They were fielding the biggest army that America had fielded since that war too, and more shells in that bombardment, that 3-hour bombardment, were fired than in the whole of the American Civil War. And it became the deadliest campaign in US military history, with 26,000 American deaths and over 96,000 wounded. And you're conscious that those numbers, when you compare to some of the great battles that France or Britain or the Commonwealth fought in the Great War, perhaps they seem small. But in that short time, from the Meuse-Argonne attack through to the last day of the war, these are not insignificant casualties. More than 125,000 American soldiers killed, wounded, and missing. This was truly America's entry into a global stage, but also its entry into industrial, mechanized warfare that drew men in and caused such horrific loss. And there was a sense, of course, that for America, part of this, how this war was sold, was that it was a war for democracy and a war to end wars. And when it came to commemorating that landscape on which that victory had been achieved by American forces in 1918, it was done on a big scale. So at Varennes, a fairly small little town, it's dominated by the vast Pennsylvania monument, which looks like some kind of Greek or Roman temple. It's massive, and you can't help but miss it as you drive through the village. But a point was being made here. America had stepped beyond its borders, and it had paid the price in blood, and it was absolutely positive that that sacrifice would never be forgotten. And at Montfaucon, the huge tall tower that dominates over that landscape, typical of this landscape, this wartime landscape, which saw rolling hills, high positions that proved difficult objectives for American soldiers to capture. American soldiers, units, divisions, corps, they made many mistakes like the British and the French and the Commonwealth and other forces had made in the earlier period of the war. And they learnt, as they advanced through this terrain, learned at high costs as doughboys fell left and right, storming these hills and capturing these positions. And at the top of Montfaucon is not just the American monument. This is, again, part of that layer that we look at as we look beyond the Somme. There is a snapshot of 1918, and that's the ruins of the church at Montfaucon, a World War I ruin, shrapnel-scarred, covered in pockmarks from artillery fire. The position was fortified. There were machine gun bunkers made to look like structures as part of the church and the buildings that were once here. There's an observation tower within the main church building itself, with steps going up into it and a clear field of vision across this ground to drop artillery fire on anyone trying to take this position. But for me, it's not the tactical knowledge that we gain by looking at this ground and assessing it from a military point of view. It is that snapshot that we get from the landscape, from the building on this landscape, that preserved church with its battle damage, its war frozen for all time in stone. That is the power of sites like this, something that we only rarely see except in this ground beyond the Somme. And then we travelled the route of the American attack up towards the village of Cunel. And I mentioned this in a recent podcast, a village that changed hands on numerous occasions. And we pulled up there to see the memorial to the 3 lads from Harvard who were commemorated in a special drinking fountain memorial that's part of the church. And there in the village street was the local worksman scraping away at the gutters, cleaning out the drains as the winter comes to an end. It's a quiet village. It's a secluded village, life goes on. But this was at the very heart of the bitter fighting involving American troops as they battled against the Hindenburg Line in the villages and the woods and the slopes surrounding it. And Cunel seems to act as a kind of conduit, really, to the past, but also to the present, pushing you ever onwards to the wooded area you can see on the slopes of the ground ahead of you towards the next village of Romagna. And there is the Meuse-Argonne American Cemetery, the largest American cemetery in Europe from either World War, with over 14,000 graves. Now, we had a special podcast on this cemetery, and I'm sure it's something that we'll return to again, like so many of these subjects. I took some video there, which will be up on the Old Front Line YouTube channel fairly soon, I hope. But again, you go there and you see the vastness of this cemetery with 14,000 graves. Physically, it's much bigger. It's got to be over 2 times as big as Tyne Cot in terms of the acreage that's there. It's this big statement on behalf of the United States, a beacon. We talk about the British cemeteries being a beacon to the Great War. This is a beacon to America's Great War and the price that it paid and the losses that it sustained and the lives that were changed forever by the deaths of the men and women that are buried in this cemetery. It's a place as you walk amongst the white crosses and the stars of David that you really begin to think, if this war had gone on, perhaps it would have become an American war, not a British war, not a French war, an American war, because they would have been probably in 1919 the major partner. But it's a war that today for America has kind of slipped away from the consciousness of most Americans. The word forgotten was so overused in the Great War centenary. But the Great War, I think, is largely forgotten in the United States. And I was pleased this week to do a little stint on an American TV channel to talk about the importance of the Great War. And I hope that somewhere in the not too distant future there will be some kind of resurgence of interest in this in America. Perhaps it will take a movie, a good movie. Perhaps it will take a TV series like Masters of the Air or Band of Brothers to hone America's attention onto that generation that fought in these fields and villages like Cunel and that now lie at rest on the slopes of this ridge. 14,000 graves of American doughboys who fell in those final months of the Great War, representing all of America, probably every state, all kinds of backgrounds, everything that America stood for and stands for today, every part of its community. Black, African American Medal of Honor winners, some of the earliest volunteers who, ashamed that America had not entered the conflict, crossed to France and joined the French Foreign Legion, pilots in the Lafayette Squadron, and so much bravery and sacrifice amongst the American units that fought on these battlefields in 1918. We left the cemetery and crossed through the Argonne forest and past the Lost Battalion Memorial. In the winter you can look down into that valley where the Lost Battalion got cut off from the rest of its force. It's a desperate, lonely place, and a curious place with the arrow pointing down to where the Lost Battalion was, and amongst the trees again the signs of the shell holes and the criss-cross paths as battles of the earlier period of the war come sharply into view as you continue through the forest and out into the ground at the beginning of the Champagne rolling downland, a chalk downland beyond. And in the distance we could see the ridge line to the northern part of the Champagne, the Blanc-Mont, where the US Marine Corps had fought alongside French troops in the last battle there near Somme in 1918. But it was an earlier battlefield and an earlier part of this sector that we were heading to. The Man de Massige, the Hand of Massige, this ridge line that looks like a hand with fingers descending down, escarpments that had those finger-like shapes, and on the top of it today, a reconstructed trench system that looks pretty much like the battlefields must have looked just immediately after the war. I've been here many, many times over the last few years. In the centenary we brought many, many groups here, and it's a place that never fails to amaze me. I put a little video, just a 30-second video of me walking through one bit of the trench onto Instagram, and something like 120,000 people watch this. It's such an impressive location. And again, it's not a frivolous thing. That's not just a spectacle. These reconstructed trenches with original material, using original methodology and tools and equipment to reconstruct what a Great War trench system once looked like. It's not just that, because here on a lonely hillside on the white chalk downlands of the Champagne, we find, I think, amongst those trenches, even more of the pathways of the Great War. The trenches, although rebuilt, somehow hold the darkness of that troglodyte world of the Western Front, of what it once was. There's an atmosphere here, a silence, but an unquiet world too, which at times I think can be disturbing when we know so much about the history of what unfolded in places like this. And of course, we can find such locations in Flanders and indeed on the Somme. But beyond the Somme, beyond it, we find perhaps the essence of that dark war, the pinnacle of what sacrifice means a century on, but also solitude, alone in our landscape, but surrounded always by the ghosts of the old front line. You've been listening to an episode of The Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. You can follow me on Twitter at Somcorps. You can follow the podcast at Old Frontline Pod. Check out the website at oldfrontline.co.uk, where you'll find lots of podcast extras and photographs and links to books that are mentioned in the podcast. And if you feel like supporting us, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/oldfrontline, or support us on Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/.